Hello, this is the News Hour on Al Jazeera. I'm Foliba Thibault, live in Doha. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, Russian missiles strike several Ukrainian cities, including the capital, Kyiv. President Putin warns there could be more to come.
This morning, massive strikes took place on air, sea and land against energy and military targets against Ukraine. If such attempts by Ukraine continue, there will be harsh responses.
Also this hour, the number of refugees worldwide is breaking records, and the United Nations is calling on rich countries to take action. And Ben Bernanke, the U.S. Fed chief during the 2008 financial crisis, is among 3 economists awarded the Nobel Prize for their work on the importance of banks.
I'm Joanna Gajrowska with the sport. Arsenal move back top of the English Premier League, and Cristiano Ronaldo scores his 700th club goal as Manchester United come from behind to beat Everton.
It's a brilliant.
Thank you for joining us. President Vladimir Putin has described Russia's barrage of missile fire on Ukrainian cities as a response to what he called terrorist attacks on Russian territory. And he warned Moscow could take even tougher action. Russian missiles struck several Ukrainian cities during rush hour on Monday morning, killing civilians and destroying infrastructure. A bridge leading into the capital has been damaged, as well as intersections, parks and tourist sites in the center of Kyiv. Residential neighborhoods were also targeted. It's the first attack on the city in months. The state emergency services says 5 people have been killed and many injured. The blasts in the center of Kyiv were mostly in the Shevchenko district. This area includes the historic Old Town as well as government offices. One missile exploded near the main building of Kyiv University and another in a park opposite. A crossing known as the Glass Bridge was also hit. It's popular with tourists and used by pedestrians and cyclists. Explosions were also reported in Lviv, Ternopil in Ukraine's west, Dnipro and Kremenchuk in central Ukraine, Zaporizhia in the south, and Kharkiv in the east. The mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, has appealed to the international community for help.
This is city of Kyiv. Just an hour ago, this attack, another attack, continued attack of Russia on Ukraine, killed civilians, millions of people living in the city of Kyiv. And this war and so-called free world must help us Ukrainians, continuing help us Ukrainians to stop this genocide of the Ukrainian population and destruction of our life, our infrastructure and our cities.
Al Jazeera's Rory Challenge is in Kyiv with more on the strikes there.
In the midst of the attacks, the response from the government, from the authorities, was to say, get inside, get to a shelter, take cover, wait this out, don't go out on the streets, don't come into Kyiv if you don't absolutely have to. This is a very dangerous situation. We have also had a couple of updates from the president, Volodymyr Zelensky himself, one earlier on when the attack started, and another one about halfway through. We can listen to what he said now.
Ukrainians, the morning is difficult. We are dealing with terrorists. Dozens of missiles, Iranian drones. They have 2 targets, the energy facilities throughout the country, and the second target is the people. Such a time, such goals were specifically chosen to cause us as much damage as possible. But we are Ukrainians. We help each other. We believe in ourselves. We restore everything that is destroyed. There may be temporary power outages now, but there will never be an interruption in our confidence in victory.
So this onslaught is something that I think the country has not seen in an entirety like this, at least since the early days of the war. The question now for Ukraine is this going to be repeated? Has Russia used up a huge amount of its precision weaponry and feels like it's made its point, as Vladimir Putin was putting it just a few minutes ago? Or is this the beginning of something that is going to become more regular? And we just don't know the answer to that at the moment.
And Al Jazeera's Hoda Abdelhamid is in Dnipro with more on the attacks in other Ukrainian cities.
This is an indication that today is very different from the past days and weeks. Dnipro has come quite regularly under airstrikes. The last one was just last week, where a family has died in the airstrike. It's also very close to Zaporizhia, only about an hour drive from here, and that city has come under regular deadly strikes over the past 9 days. More than 60 people have died in Zaporizhia, all civilians. But I think what you see today, people in the shelter, is an indication that this is a very different day. This is a day where people don't know what's going to happen next, because we have been traveling around this part of the country. We've been to Zaporizhia, we've been to Kharkiv, we've been here in Dnipro, back and forth. We've been to Kryvyi Rih. All of these four cities have been coming under attack quite regularly. And I would always be amazed at the fact that people just continued with their lives, whether they were sitting in a restaurant having a meal or they were walking on the street. They should have brushed off this air siren or what could happen. Not today. You have them sitting in shelters. We understand that other shelters are also quite busy. There's a red alert ongoing since this morning all over the country. And this is a scene really that I have not seen or witnessed in this country since the very early days of the war, when Dnipro was a completely empty city. No one was around.
Well, as we mentioned, Russia's President Vladimir Putin says the strikes are a response to attacks by Ukraine.
It is impossible not to respond. This morning, massive strikes took place on air, sea and land against energy and military targets against Ukraine. If such attempts by Ukraine continue, there will be harsh responses.
Mohammed Val is in Moscow for us. So, Mohammed, a direct response to the explosion on the Kerch Strait Bridge, which links Crimea to mainland Russia. Tell us more about what President Putin had to say about these massive airstrikes in Ukraine today.
Yes, fully. President Putin mentioned some attempts by the Ukrainian intelligence services to also strike at other targets, including nuclear targets in Russia or in the area under its control, and energy targets. And he basically said that this is not tolerable here in Russia, and that Russia will respond, and this is going to be the beginning. Deputy Chairman of the Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, also, he used the word scene one. He said this is scene one, giving that expectation that Russia will continue to strike at targets in Ukraine if Ukraine doesn't stop what it is doing, something like what happened to the Kerch Bridge. But also remember that, the Russians as people, have been expecting this. And Medvedev said that he said this is what the Russians have been expecting, because for several weeks, the Russians were watching those defeats at the front line, and they were questioning the capacity, the capability, or even the willingness of the highest command in Russia to do something about the war. And the attack on the Kerch Bridge came as an opportunity for the leadership here to show that Russia hasn't used all the force it has, and it can do more to defend what it considers now its territory, and also to protect its strategic interests.
And we've also heard, Mohammed, from the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, who says Russia and Belarus have agreed to deploy a joint group of forces to Ukraine.
That's right. President Lukashenko has always been seen as a very close ally to Russia, and he was teetering on the edge of being a part of this war, and now he has come with these statements saying that he has a proof that Ukrainians are planning to hit at targets inside Belarus, and that something must be done before that can happen. You can listen to more of what he said about that in the following statement.
Покажется Tell the president of Ukraine and the other lunatics, if any of them are still there, that the Crimean Bridge will seem to them like a walk in the park if they ever touch a single square meter of our territory with their dirty hands.
So Lukashenko there basically, using this situation to show support to Russia, and he talked about the creation of a joint force between Russia and Belarus, a regional force, as he described it, that will go and defend the interests of the two countries. So Lukashenko is joining this in a way, or ready to join this fight, if he has the right conditions, or what he said, if Ukraine attacks Belarus. And that is a huge threat to the scope of this war. We have seen Russia now expanding its targets beyond the area of the fighting in eastern and southern Ukraine. And if Belarus joins, it means this is no longer just a war between two countries. It risks to become much wider than that, and that's what many are fearing.
All right, thank you for that update. Mohammed Val, live there in Moscow. Well, there's been plenty of reaction to the Russian airstrikes on Ukraine this Monday. Natasha Butler joins us from Paris. Natasha, condemnation from the European Union and NATO.
Yes, a lot of reaction from parts of the EU, as you would expect. Barbaric war crimes, those are some of the ways that some EU leaders are describing these Russian missile strikes on Ukraine, on civilian infrastructure, on civilian areas. The EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, said that these strikes were extremely and deeply shocking. He said that there is no place for such acts in the 21st century. His office also putting out a message saying that Belarus must not become involved after we heard from Minsk that Minsk could consider sending Belarusian troops to fight alongside Russian troops in Ukraine. A worrying upscale that would be indeed for the EU. We've also heard from the head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, who said that these strikes were horrific, indiscriminate. We know that Ukraine's certainly going to be top of the agenda this week when NATO defense ministers meet in Brussels to discuss the situation. Ukraine certainly urging NATO members to send more arms, more weaponry, more support, more military aid, everything that they can get. They say this is what they need in order to continue to fight Russia. And here in France, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, spoke to Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, on the telephone a little earlier, saying that he was, of course, deeply concerned by the situation, that France would continue to support Ukraine and scale up some of the military equipment that it is sending. France has been under some criticism for perhaps not sending as much military support in terms of equipment and aid to Ukraine as it could do for being such a major European power. France will be one of the G7 members that will be meeting in an emergency video conference on Tuesday. That is something that Volodymyr Zelensky called for today. That meeting, as I said, taking place by video conference. G7 leaders will be discussing this latest situation.
Thank you for that, Natasha Butler, live there with reaction from Paris. Well, let's now speak to Sviatoslav Jurash, who's an MP for Lviv and a member of President Zelensky's Servant of the People Party. He is joining us from Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Thank you so much for being with us on Al Jazeera. President Putin, as you heard, says the mass strikes are revenge for the Kerch Bridge attack, and he says there could be more to come. What is your reaction to this, and how worried are you about what else could come?
The last 8 months, we have been pretty used to Russian terrorist tactics in attacking civil infrastructure and attacking vital infrastructure choke points. I mean, this is basically another step in Russian attack on our nation's abilities, and nothing is that different now than the reality that we've seen over the last 8 months. This is another horrifying, deadly, pointless act in this war, which is Russia's waging, as Mr. Putin himself said in the first day of the war, destroy our nation. We shall battle on, and we shall survive this and survive so much else.
But cities
until
like
we
Kyiv,
win it.
you say you've been used to this for the past 8 months, but cities like Kyiv, the capital where you are, had been relatively spared until now. You have at least 5 people killed there today. The Defense Ministry is saying that there will be revenge. What are your options going forward? What is Ukraine's strategy going to be now if the counteroffensive that Ukraine has launched is answered with such violence from the Russians?
In the first months of the war, Kyiv was besieged and Kyiv was shelled daily, and so many have died defending our capital. So that's why I'm saying this is unfortunately and sadly one of the realities that we've faced over the last 8 months. As far as the options we have on the table, well, that's something that is not best not discussed on a TV channel as popular as yours. But we have been driving offensive, pushing back Russians in the east and the south of the country. We shall continue that.
So the offensives, the counteroffensive in the east and south will continue, despite the Russian threats?
They have been successful, and they have been very clearly aimed at showing the world the reality of Russian power, which is nothing more than a bluff. And as far as our ability to wage war and win back our country, it has have been shown by success and success.
The Kerch Strait Bridge explosion, which is what led to this onslaught of Russian airstrikes on Kyiv and other cities in Ukraine. Does Ukraine claim responsibility for that attack on the bridge?
The first crime there was the annexation of Crimea, the illegal attempt to take over another country's chunk and claim that nothing has happened back in 2014. And the bridge that has been illegally built and essentially is a demonstration of Mr. Putin's claim to power is but another affront to Ukraine's sovereignty. And that bridge explosion is something that should have been predicted by everybody.
So is Ukraine behind that explosion?
I cannot comment on that, but it's very clear that bridge essentially shouldn't have been there in the first place.
All right. We've heard strong condemnation from NATO, from the European Union. Joseph Borrell saying such acts have no place in the 21st century. Does this go far enough for you?
Basically, again, Russia is trying to say, and through the words that you read from Mr. Medvedev, former president of Russia, Russia's plans to do so much more, and especially the new commander Russia's appointed to lead the Russian forces in Ukraine is known for his cruelty and his lack of regard for human life. So we are expecting everything and anything to happen.
So, but what would you like to see from the European Union, from NATO? Ukraine has already received a great deal of military support, of course, from the West. Tough sanctions have been imposed on Moscow. What more would you like to see happen?
And we welcome all that. But again, so much more needs to happen as far as cutting Russia from supplying and receiving a lot of its resources from the European community. It's very clear that Russia, in sales of oil and gas, they've been bringing, despite the damages to the gas pipeline and despite the attempts at the oil sanctions on Russia, is essentially receiving lots of its revenues from European Union countries. That is something that definitely needs to be cut going forward, because Russia has shown itself very clearly not a member of the international community, but a malign actor in it, trying to destroy national rule of law.
Thank you so much for talking to us and sharing your views. Sviatoslav Yurash, a Ukrainian MP, joining us there from Kyiv. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Now, Moldova says 3 cruise missiles fired by Russia at Ukraine violated its airspace on Monday. The government has summoned the Russian ambassador to explain. Foreign Minister Nico Popescu said he condemned the action in the strongest possible terms. And we'll have more on the war in Ukraine later on in the news hour. And also other world news, including floods devastate parts of Venezuela, leaving homes, schools and businesses destroyed. And in sport, this Korean golfer matches a rare feat achieved by Tiger Woods. Now to some of the day's other news, and North Korea's leader says its latest missile launches were a way to test the ability of its nuclear weapons to wipe out American and South Korean targets. Kim Jong-un also acknowledged plans to conduct more tests. He said the launches were in response to joint naval drills between the U.S. and South Korea. Rob McBride has more from Seoul.
The North Koreans have said very little about this flurry of ballistic missile activity that's gone on pretty much unchecked for 2 weeks, continual launching of these missiles, the last week of September, the first week of October. And then today, Monday, the official North Korean news agency comes out with almost a pronouncement, a long declaration of exactly what it's been doing, the dates of the tests, the types of missiles being launched and tested.